Welcome to Lit Happens, Unpacking Senior English. I'm Adriel.
And I'm Belle.
We're experienced English teachers dedicated to supporting both new and experienced educators in a world in which we are often time poor, to empower our students to excel in their English studies.
If you're an English teacher, like us, navigating this curriculum, then this podcast is designed with you in mind. And our mission really is to break down the complexities by unpacking English nationally. Welcome back, everyone, to another Lit Happens episode. I'm Belinda here with Adriel. And
hey guys, how are we?
Hi. And today we're going to get through our next text selection. We're actually going to be doing standard module A, language, identity, and culture. And lucky for us, Adriel is going to lead us through the contemporary Asian Australian poets. So a real treat for us today.
Yeah.
And so what we'll just get into first, Adriel, could you please unpack for us this rubric, Module A, Language, Identity and Culture, maybe explain for us some key concepts and how they might guide the study of the 6 prescribed poems within this contemporary Asian Australian poets selection.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, it's kind of a lovely unit, this one, the Module A rubric. I really like this idea of language, identity and culture being highlighted into sort of this one framework in which we sort of unpack, or we get the students to sort of critically explore how language operates as this powerful tool in constructing and reflecting the idea of identity and culture, which I really, really love. Some of the key things that the rubric emphasizes for our 6 poems in the sort of contemporary Asian Australian poet unit is, the fact that we look at how language shapes and expresses individual and collective identity. We go into this a little bit more. This involves analyzing how the poets themselves use language to convey their personal sense of self, as well as their connection to the broader cultural groups as to what they're a part of. We'll see this, for example, with Melinda Bobis in This Is Where It Begins. We see her identities as Filipino-Australian being shaped through her use of multilingualism, which we'll cover a little bit more as we get into the text. The rubric sort of then looks to encourage the students then to consider how, these types of linguistic choices reflect experiences of belonging, maybe alienation, and ideas of the sort. We then look at the rubric looking at an exploration of the relationship between language, culture, and context. Okay, and we already know, like in our previous episodes, we speak quite fondly of the importance of context in a whole heap of our study. It's so important that we get the kids to know the context. So when we're looking at contemporary Asian poetry, they have to make sure they know the poems off by heart, pretty much off the, like the back of their hand, but also know the context of each of the relative or respective poets. So yeah, anyway, when we look at this, it requires us to investigate how historical, social, and cultural context of the poets influence their use of language. Okay, so the anthology itself that we sort of look at, we have a selection of poems, but the whole anthology was published in about 2013, and it emerges from Australia's multicultural landscape following the abolition of things like, the White Australia policy in 1973. We see poets like Yung Yu in New Accents write about some of the challenges of migration. We look at ideas of cultural hybridity in a society that was, historically looking at an Anglo-Australian lens. And, that generally would shape the identity. So we're looking at another perspective here when it comes to these texts. And what we see is the rubric guides us to consider how this context then shapes the poet's language and the themes that are present within each of their poems. If we go a little bit further in unpacking the rubric as well, we start to look at the idea of how texts affirm, challenge, or negotiate cultural assumptions, again, through the language. So you really, really need to, like I said, know the poems. The kids have to know the poems. But we're looking at these 3 ideas, all right? How does the text affirm? Okay, so how does it agree? How does it challenge? How does it disagree? Or, look to, I guess, challenge some of those ideas. It is in the word. It's probably what are some of those sort of tensions that we can start to see?
Yeah.
And then how do we then negotiate these cultural assumptions in an age that we were saying, like the poems that we're sort of looking at come across this historical period, that has this very Anglo-Australian identity to it, to now one in 2025, which you can see the landscape of Australia. It is very multicultural in its
Yeah.
lens. So these poems are very significant in that sort of case. And it's very important to get the kids to sort of understand this. We can see this through the poems, which often challenge some of the stereotypes about Asian Australians in particular. It is Asian Australian poetry that we're looking at. And some of these things that we look at are the expectations maybe to assimilate, and instead, they affirm maybe some of these diverse cultural identities. And we see this, for example, with Translucent Jade, which is a beautiful poem. And it
It
uses
is.
that symbol of jade, like that precious sort of stone, the name, the Chinese name as well, to negotiate that connection between the poet's Chinese heritage whilst living in Australia. So
Okay.
we'll cover that a little bit more as we get into the poems. And the final thing that the rubric sort of underscores or highlights is the importance of textual features. Okay, so
Okay.
language, textual features in conveying meaning. So
Yeah.
we have to get the students to analyze, or they must analyze, I guess, techniques. And some of these techniques could include things like imagery, metaphor, tone, amongst many others. I really recommend getting a glossary or a list for the students to sort of commit to memory. If you are even in the standard course, they still need to know this. Okay. So by allowing them that glossary, it allows them to then understand how each of these poets construct identity and culture within their respective works. Okay, we sort of looked at this idea of how language shapes meaning, and it's through the techniques, isn't it? Okay,
Yeah.
how the
Definitely.
texts and the poets shape meaning, I should say, not language. Focus there, but it's the techniques. It's the techniques,
Yeah.
techniques. It's something that all English teachers will always say. And what this focus does is it puts a focus on language positions, on how language positions it as both a mirror and a maker, of identity, which is a central
Right.
of the Module A unit. So I guess in
Mm.
studying these 6 poems, some of the questions that you might ask your students are the following, which the rubric prompts us to ask of ourselves. Number one, and these might be like the basis of some essay questions for teachers that are listening. You can
Lovely.
essay questions
Perfect.
to get the kids to start practicing right from the beginning. Or the first one could be, how does language reflect the poet's personal and cultural identity or identities? Question number 2, how does context influence the linguistic choices? And number 3, you might look at, how do these poems challenge or affirm cultural values? Like, there's just 3 basic ins into this unit. And by addressing these questions with some of these detailed pieces of textual evidence that you might gather along your annotations and your study, you'll see that students can start to develop the nuanced understanding required for, there's higher order responses in the band 5 and 6 range for this unit. But yeah, that's about it for a bit of the purpose of the textual conversations, the language identity and culture unit. We've been doing too
Yeah.
much advanced stuff at the moment.
Yeah. We were on that for quite a few weeks, weren't we?
Yeah, that's right.
No,
But
that's
the language,
excellent.
yeah,
Yeah. So
no,
it is really
exactly right.
this role of language in shaping identity and culture, representing it, and offering like new insights or perhaps challenging preconceived ones as well.
Yeah, exactly right.
Amazing.
Exactly right. So yeah, like we emphasize quite a bit there, language. The kids need to know that. They need to know the techniques, and that's the framework really for a good response in this unit.
Amazing. Perfect. Okay. Well, let's get into then our next section with the analysis. I'm sure that teachers would really love to get a sense of a close reading of some of those texts. So you know that you're going to do one for This Is Where It Begins by Melinda Bobus. You can do Home by Miriam Weiwei Low and New Accents by, how do you pronounce this one, Adriel?
I normally go Wang Yu, but I am
Okay.
probably butchering the pronunciation there as well. So I do apologize.
That's
to
okay.
Mr.
The beauty is you might have some Asian Australian students in your class that will lend a hand with some of the pronunciation,
Mm,
which is quite nice, I think, connects them to the poetry.
yeah,
All right.
100%.
So in terms of those three texts, then, what would you recommend in terms of undertaking an analysis of how specific textual features and techniques in those key poems are constructing a sense of personal identity?
Mm, mm. So as you've just sort of said, we want to focus on how their textual features construct personal identity. Okay. That's so important. And I guess we'll start off with Melinda Bobus. This is where it
Sure.
begins. She's got a really cool voice. I mean, if you do a bit of context work, there's a nice little YouTube clip there that you can get your kids to start off with. We're
Oh,
sort
that's a
of
great
leading into
idea.
some of the teaching strategies here, but she is a professor of the creative arts, I'm pretty sure, down at the University of Wollongong. I don't know if she's still there, but definitely good to get the kids on board there. But what we see in her poem is it's a poem that explores personal identity through her Filipino heritage.
Okay.
And one of the key techniques that you might look at this, and I'm not going to go into depth with each of the poems, or else we'll be here for about 5 or 6 days.
For
But
sure.
but just a few things that teachers can sort of look at. Some of the key ones, maybe one for each sort of poem that you
Yeah,
can
that
go
would be
along.
greed. Yeah.
So a key sort of language feature, key technique that we see in this poem right at the beginning is the contrast or the juxtaposed sort of language that we see. It starts off with the Filipino language and then transitions into the English language. And this technique here is a bit of code switching.
Sure.
And she actually specifies it. It's evident in the line. She says, "I write in Bicol, Filipino, and then English." So what we see is this use of multiple languages reflecting
Mhm.
Boba's hybrid identity. I love that.
Right.
It's, these three different languages there. So you've got the dialect of Bicol, you've got Filipino as a whole, and then you've got English, as the English language, reflecting her, what we say
Yeah.
is a hybrid identity, which, I mean, we call it hybrid, but in this day and age, with the way that the world is interconnected, we've got so many students now, especially with that maybe Asian background there, that have this sort of connection to this type of hybrid identity as well.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
we see Melinda in this sort of circumstance. She navigates her ancestral roots and her life in Australia. So you've got this parallel sort of world of her ancestral roots of the Filipino background, and it goes alongside the narrative of her Australian sort of journey. And we see this sort of building towards her identity as this Asian Australian living in Australia now. So what
Yeah.
we see is things, for example, like the repetition of the word beginnings. This creates a rhythmic structure that mirrors her journey of tracing identity back to her origins,
Yeah.
while ancestral imagery, such as, when she says, quote, "my grandfather's hands," grounds her sense of self in family history. And what
Yeah.
we see
Nice.
is these techniques construct Boba's personal identity as layered and multifaceted. So her
Okay.
personal identity is layered and multifaceted. And this is shaped both by her heritage and her migration sort of experience living here now in
Okay.
Australia.
So like the two kind of combining together in a sense.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's sort of reflected through that language. Now, there are heaps of language techniques and structural techniques that you can undertake with your students. Really, get that classroom sort of talking. Like I said, context is important. Look her up. I think there is a fantastic YouTube video there on her background. It's about 10 minutes in length. I always used to get my kids to listen to that just to get an
Amazing.
understanding of her context. So there are some tools out there that you can look at.
That's
But yeah,
excellent. Yeah, very great starting point for this is where it begins. And what
mm,
about the next poem, Home, by
yeah,
Miriam Way Low?
yeah. So we're home is beautiful as well. And we see
Mm,
sort of the same sort of ideas here, but in home, what we look at is a little bit more of a focus on setting, don't we? So the poet
mm,
examines her personal identity as this Chinese sort of crossbreed with maybe that Scottish Australian lens. I mean, the poem
mhm,
uses sensory imagery of setting. So, like when we see the smell of rice cooking to evoke memories of her cultural roots
mhm.
in that Chinese sort of Singaporean area, contrasting with her life in Australia.
Yeah.
The poem has what we call, and this is where we focus a little bit more on the structure, a tripartite structure, which we see the poem is divided into sections about Singapore, Australia, and a spiritual home. So again, it's very important for you guys to actually focus on context, because you look at, the cultural heritage or the cultural context, but we also have to bring into account here Miriam's strong religious or spiritual context as well, which plays a very
Sure.
big part. She
Part of
speaks
her
about that.
identity.
Yeah, and she speaks about that heavenly home, throughout the entirety of this poem as well. But what we see with the tripart structure is it sort of mirrors her fragmented sense of belonging as well. And when we're talking about this idea of fragmented sense, it's like, do I really belong? Where is my actual home? Like, these are questions that all migrants, not let alone Asian Australian poets that we're focusing on
Yes.
here, but all migrants will go through this experience. And this is a connection that a lot of your students will have with the poems.
Sure.
So it's reflected through the structure there. And we also see language techniques like the metaphor of home, which is the title itself, as being both this physical and emotional encapsulation of low struggle to define her identity across these cultures. I think that's quite important for people to sort of look at as well. When you're looking at the metaphor of home, it's not just, what does home entail, but, looking at it through the lens of both physical, which is generally what we say, home is a building, but also that emotional sort of struggle to define identity, attached to home. So really get the kids to think about this. And this highlights her personal journey to maybe reconciling the duality of her heritage. And that's something that we definitely look at in
So like
Miriam's
connection
poem.
and disconnection, for example.
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. So it's like,
Wonderful.
like, for example, I often say when I'm teaching home itself, what is a home? Like I'll draw a quick little stick figure picture, or I'll get the kids like, what is home? And you brainstorm a whole heap of different ideas about what home means. And when kids start to look at some of we can get into those metaphysical ideas, home going beyond the physical there. I know we're talking about standard English here, but it's good. Like, if your kids can start to use these terms,
Yes.
by all means, it's going to stand out at the marking center.
Sure.
So yeah, get them to really think about, what are the meanings beyond in terms of home, and if you can connect it to like this idea here of encapsulating an emotional sort of landscape of struggle in order to define identity, you've got a good thing going there for that poem. And then we might turn to new accents. This is another sort of poem that we look at where we see a little bit of struggle with identity as well, as a Chinese migrant for our poet, Mr. Yu here. And what we see is this poem uses language to convey that journey. Yep. Okay, that struggle with identity as a Chinese migrant, living in Australia now. And you see the tone is a little bit different in New Accents. Whereas the previous two poems have quite a uplifting tone about their new life, albeit with struggle.
But like
In this,
possibilities, hope.
yeah, that's right. That's right. It's hope. It's a new world. It's
Okay.
a new adventure. It's a place with lots of opportunities. Whereas this poem here actually speaks of one of the probably less highlighted struggles of having, this accent. And I think accent is definitely something that we can speak into. It's something
Yep.
that's often overlooked for migrants as well. Because when you hear someone, it'd be like for me, for example, I'll use this example with the kids. I'll say, if I walked into the classroom with you guys, and those that are watching this clip on YouTube, you will see that I probably don't look like your typical Anglo-Australian. However, I said to the kids, I said, well, what would your understanding of me be? Before I even say a word, what are your ideas about my identity? Oh, sir, you look like you have a particular ethnic background, and maybe you might sound like this, that, or the other. So we make these assumptions.
Yep.
But what we see in this new accents is how, an accent for someone, like when kids hear me then afterwards, they're like, oh, but sir, like you don't sound like anyone else. You sound like you're Australian, or Western Sydney in particular. Like, this is the dialect that we get.
Sure.
But what we see with the new accents here is that struggle associated with accents, like that tone, that voice. And we see this, personal struggle really conveyed through it. We can also see that metaphor of, that new country, which it's actually written in that line, I carry on my tongue, which portrays Yu's sort of accent as a marker of his identity. I think that's very, very
right.
important to see.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this symbolizes that burden of cultural difference that is highlighted or connoted
Mm.
by that tongue, or that
Yeah.
sort of burden of having a different voice by sounding different. It's something that
Yeah.
you can really speak into with the kids, and you'll see that some kids will connect with it, some kids probably won't understand it. So it's a good sort of place to have a bit of discourse, because the frustrated tone paired with that direct address, like you'll see that it'll often say like quote that word you. This establishes a confrontational sort of dialogue with Australian society in a whole,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
this reflects his alienation that we see.
Yeah.
And when we look at that technique, it constructs use identity as one marked with, or marked by resistance, I guess, and
Hmm.
that idea of negotiation. Like, how does he negotiate this new identity that we sort of discussed a little bit about what that first part of the rubric, not first part, but what the rubric sort of entails for students. But yeah, that's a bit about those three poems there.
Yeah. That's a great starting point. Well, yeah, I think you've touched on some really nice language, identity, cultural kind of ideas that teachers
Mhm.
can use and springboard off of, and a great selection of techniques to get them started. Like you said, there's going to be a lot to choose from, but this is where we can begin and get going and encourage a discussion with the students to get further into the poems. That's excellent. So on the back of that, then, what teaching strategies would you recommend that's really going to help students not just analyze the poems, but analyze and connect them in regards to building towards a band 6 response? So what
Yeah,
strategies?
yeah. So your guided close readings are very, very important. Okay, like
Yeah.
I highly recommend you do things like pair share activity. So once the kids have done their context work and you're going through the poems, it's important for you to get the kids to read it, maybe get them then to do a pair share in a group sort of work or group sort of setting, and then you as a teacher need to go through and help them annotate some of these techniques that we sort of highlighted. So for example, we're looking at Boba's poem there, Melinda's poem, you're looking at code switching. Well, whereabouts do we see this in the poem? And get the kids to highlight it, annotate the poem. And then even things like the metaphor that we sort of discussed there, and use sort of poem there, and link these. Okay, so don't just say it's a metaphor, don't just say this is code switching, but they need to
Yeah.
link it to some of those key components of the text. So maybe things like
Okay.
personal identity, how it shapes identity, all those sorts of
Okay.
ideas there.
Yeah. So
You
the
also got
function of that technique in representing
exactly,
something rubric. Yeah. Great.
exactly,
Great.
yeah. And you've also got again, encouraging that sort of discussion with the kids. I think that's very important. And get them to
Mhm.
think about how language reflects their identity, how it adds
Yeah.
maybe a reflective layer for them. I like with this unit, especially building into like your close study of literature for Mod B as well as the next unit, depending on how you've structured your year. But
Mhm.
I do recommend like short analytical writing tasks or mini essays.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
can sort of ask them questions like, how does my language shape my sense of self,
Mhm.
sorry. And this can deepen their analysis, providing, a bit of personal engagement, not only with the text, but gets them to look at the textual detail needed for that band 6 response. They can use this to, write the responses when we do come to the essays later on.
Excellent. There's some really great strategies. Do you think we could move on to a few more of those poems? So we've got
Yeah.
Mother by Vung Pham, and then Circular Breathing by is it J.R. Savish? How would you
Yes.
pronounce that one? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And
I've
Translucent
always said
Jade by
I've always said Savage, but I think I'm wrong
Sure.
again. So I do
That's
have to
okay. Yeah,
apologize.
the beauty of an essay is it's read, it's not like said
That's
out loud.
correct.
So
That's correct. They'll
we're
get
not
the
gonna hurt
essence.
it.
The
That's
markers will get the essence
that's
of what you're trying to say. Yeah.
that's
All
it.
right. We'll start off
What
with Mother
yeah,
then.
please,
We'll,
textual
s- we'll, s-
features. Mm-hmm.
yeah. Okay. So Vung here. This is a beautiful poem. Actually, it's a beautiful
Mm-hmm.
poem about cultural identity as a
Yeah,
Vietnamese
lovely.
Australian now. So we're getting a whole heap of different voices across
Asian
Asia.
perspectives. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and what you're seeing is the motif of the mother. I
Mm-hmm.
love this. It's a whole journey throughout the entirety of this poem, and the imagery that coincides with that motif. I mean, you got the language such as like her hands, weaving stories into my skin. Like it's so nice. And this serves as that cultural anchor that we see throughout the poem, linking our poet to his heritage. Okay, so Vung Pham is a male, just to clarify that with our audience as well.
Thank you.
But yeah, we'll also say this with the use of enjambment across the lines. There's quite a bit of that.
Okay.
And this creates a sense of continuity, and this mirrors that transmission of cultural values from Vietnam to Australia. I think that's quite important to sort of look into. Again, enjambment acts as quite a decisive sort of technique here. And I'll just repeat that. It mirrors the transmission of cultural values from the Vietnamese background to the Australian sort of values that we see present. And we'll know that there is often a disconnect. It's why multiculturalism is a term that, I mean, I know myself in the early 2000s, it was a big term. And Australia is a multicultural country. But it can often highlight, the sense of alienation that people may feel.
Yeah.
I know lots of sort of scholars, modern sort of unis are now moving into this cosmopolitan sort of term. But what we see with this idea of multiculturalism, we can see how, people can be in between cultures at a time, especially being born in a certain society and then having that struggle or that tension connecting with their background. So it's definitely something that we see in this poem, especially for Vung's mum, escaping the Vietnamese conflict. We see, as I think one of the final lines of the poems is, as they see Saigon sort of burning, and it is definitely something that is quite present. But we also see this tone of gratitude, which underscores sort of Pham's deep connection to his roots as well, constructing his cultural identity as one rooted in familial and historical memory. So he really connects with the story or the narrative of his mum through this, and then it's sort of highlighted through bits and pieces of the poem. I mean, you can have the plucking of the hair, for example. That is definitely one of those narrative features that you can really delve into. And like I said, I'm just covering the surface here with a few techniques that students.
No, this is very helpful. Yeah.
But yeah, definitely something for all teachers to consider. Then we can move into maybe Circular Breathing here by a poet, Jaya. This one's an interesting poem because the poem explores cultural identity through the lens of, again, a different sort of Asian Australian voice here. I think, if I'm correct, there's a Sri Lankan lens, but there's also an engagement with the Indigenous Australian traditions here. Right, so we have
First Nations representations.
That's correct, yeah. So we see right at the beginning of the poem, you see an extended metaphor of a didgeridoo playing. In particular, we hear, like, quote, a drone that hums through the body, and this symbolizes that cultural sort of fusion. And what we see with the symbolic nature of it, it blends savages. I apologize once again, heritage with Australia's First Nations culture there. Okay, so there's this blending of the Asian Australian poet with Australia's First Nations culture. We also see a rhythmic structure which mimics this breathing technique. Okay, so playing the didgeridoo, get the kids to sort of research that, understand how that works, breathing technique, understand the rhythmic structure there, and by mimicking the breathing technique in the poem, the structure of the poem, it reinforces resilience and cross-cultural dialogue. Reflecting the poet's identity as a product of multiple cultural influences. And that in essence, that in essence is basically like what each of these poems could highlight, this idea of reflecting identity as a product of multiple cultural influences.
Lovely. That's wonderful. And then lastly, Translucent Jade.
Yep. So Translucent Jade by Maureen Ten. This is beautiful. I love the symbolism of jade. Get the students to start to look at, what jade represents in the Chinese culture there. I think she mentions, this idea of jade, translucent. This is my Chinese name as well. So there is a bit of code switching here as well. We look at, cultural identity being conveyed through, in particular for this poem though, through that symbolism of jade. So this represents her connection to her Chinese heritage. I think one of the lines at the beginning is, "My grandfather gave me that name, but it was eventually replaced, lost, forgotten." Um, Apologies, I'm not quoting it directly, but like you get the essence
That's
of it. And
okay.
we just,
Yes, definitely we do. Yep.
yeah, and we see this like again, this struggle. All right, it's like, well, which identity do I choose? Do I choose the one that was given to me by my grandparents,
Mm,
that background,
mm,
or that ancestral sort of heritage,
mhm.
um, or do I move forward with my new sort of heritage, which is this
Right.
Australian name, Jade, Maureen
Mm,
Ten Chen Yu, I think it was her Chinese name,
mhm.
if I'm correct. But we see her representation or representing her connection to that Chinese heritage throughout the whole of this poem. We also see a bit of tactile imagery and soft tone to evoke a sense of reverence, while the poem structure highlights this idea of intergenerational sort of imagery or
Okay.
memory, I should say, intergenerational memory, constructing Ten's identity as one that is tied to her cultural past in the contemporary Australian landscape or Australia's present sort of day. So it's quite an interesting poem. There's lots of techniques. You could spend 2 or 3 days actually just going through that poem. But like I
Mm.
said, get the kids to understand at least 2 to 3 of these poems like the back of their hand. They need to know a whole heap of that. But yeah, like if we're looking at teaching strategies again, you might, like I said, get them to have this understanding of techniques. So you might do a workshop on techniques, where you might ask students to identify things like motifs, extended metaphors, look at symbolism in depth, look at alternate meaning. You might discuss cultural significance in these workshops. Um, Comparative tables often work quite well to map some of the imagery across these
Mhm.
poems. This
Mhm.
can often deepen their understanding. Creative tasks. So they could write a poem maybe using a cultural symbol from
Yeah,
their own
that's lovely.
background.
Oh,
Yeah,
lovely.
like
Great idea.
these are different things that they can, and what they do is they add value by encouraging that personal engagement, but also analytical insight. Okay, if they can write their own poems and engage with some of the techniques that these poets are using, based off their reading to write stuff that they've done at the beginning of year 11, it definitely adds value and builds them towards that band 6 sort of response
Mm.
later on.
That shaping meaning. Oh, that's excellent. I think you've given a really nice overview of each of the poems, a beautiful starting point with some great techniques to work with. If we were to just move on now, looking at the 6 poems together, how might we examine them collectively to look at how, as a collective or as a group, how would we actually examine language and textual techniques to explore the complexities of identity, to
Mhm.
explore the tensions
Mm.
represented, and I guess the challenges, insights?
Yeah,
How would
yeah.
we
So
connect?
what we see is these poems are quite rich, okay? And when we're talking about rich, they all come together and represent the ideas and the multiplicity or the multiple perspectives when it comes to this idea of identity. Identity is
Mm,
huge. If you start with like that question with
yeah.
your kids, what is identity? I guarantee you this, you're going to spend probably 5, 10 minutes, even longer, like them questioning themselves, like, what is identity? What does it mean?
Mm, mm-hmm.
Um, what are the things that contribute to identity? So these poems all come to the table with something to give, something to add, and this reflects that complexity of being Asian Australian, in particular.
Yeah,
That's the challenge, that's a tension that's pushed through when we're looking at all of these poems as a whole.
sure.
Um, as we mentioned before, with some of the techniques in each of these, we see the code switching in Melinda Boba's poem. That represents her hybrid identity. Miriam Weiwei Low employs, that sensory imagery and structure to navigate her fragmented belonging. We see Yu's sort of new accent relying on the metaphor and tone to express alienation. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Motifs in Fam's mother and enjambment to anchor cultural continuity, and so on and so forth. Like we got a few other ideas. I think Savija's sort of, there we go. I've changed my um, pronunciation of that name 5 or 6 times now. Again, I apologize for
That's
the I
okay.
there, but
That's
it
okay.
employs that extended metaphor and rhythm to depict cultural fusion. And then,
Yeah.
transition Jade is symbolism and imagery, to connect to
Yeah.
heritage. So collectively, these techniques, which go from like multilingualism, imagery, metaphor, structure, and tone, like a whole heap of if we want to sum it all up there, they reveal identity as being dynamic. Get the kids to understand what that word dynamic means.
Mm-hmm.
And it's shaped by personal, historical, cultural roots,
Yeah.
whilst also, understanding that societal context. So there are a few things that teachers do need to consider here in order to add value.
Mm-hmm.
I would often say, again, I've just covered the surface with the techniques, but in order to deep dive into these, you can facilitate maybe debates. You can look at Socratic discussions with the kids,
Lovely.
where you ask students to argue. Questions like, does language unite or divide identity? That might be a
Mm-hmm.
good question. It might get them thinking. Have their
Mm-hmm.
classroom do a mock trial, do something like that, and get them to use specific quotes from the poem. So we're actually using evidence to back up why we're saying certain things.
Lovely.
And what you're doing by, maybe an activity like that is you're encouraging critical thinking. I think
Yeah.
also peer reviews. Okay, so get them to write their analytical paragraphs. Like I said, those short little mini essays, and rather than get your students to just bring it straight to yourself as a teacher, give it to a peer. Get them to review. How can they refine their analysis? So getting them in that process of providing feedback or feed forward elements to their peers
Mm-hmm.
helps them to integrate sort of not only multiple techniques for whoever they're reviewing, but gets them to think about, well, actually, this is something that I probably have to actually include into my work as well. And so what
Yeah.
these strategies do is, they help to foster that more sophisticated, evidence-based, textual evidence-based understanding, which we often see is needed for that Band 6 response for our
Yeah.
students.
You're really providing that environment for them to take all that poetry and consider what is their insight, what is their perspective, and that becomes a more nuanced approach, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's correct. That's
Yeah.
correct. Yeah.
That's lovely. All right. Well, there's some really nice connections and kind of anchor points to get teachers started and get their students started. Well, I guess the next bit, once you've done those kind of combinations and comparisons and looking at those tensions, the next bit is starting to prepare them for their eventual, hopefully, Band 6 response, right?
Mm,
So what kind of practical steps can teachers take in their classroom to guide their students in not only crafting but making sure that what they've crafted is an evaluation and that it's integrating the insights into the concept of language, identity, and culture from a range of the poems? Like, what are some
mm,
practical steps here?
mm. So some of the practical steps we can
Mm-hmm.
include for our teaching sort of strategies include things like planning. So you might ask your students to look at techniques. I think comparative tables here definitely of benefit when you're looking at some of those comparative tables. I know I've had a few kids that have done really, really well or in standard English in these essays, and they would have very strong tables in which they compare the techniques. And what I guess the comparative tables allow is, you might have one technique in this poem and it might be used very differently in another poem. And it's a nice way to sort of synthesize ideas for students. It can have a great intertextual sort of element there when it comes to their body paragraphs as well. But yeah, if they develop really, really good technique tables and have a good understanding of how each of those techniques are used in each of those poems, get them to do it for all 6 of the poems,
Mm-hmm.
then you'll be able to move into like the drafting of your mini essays or full essays. I highly encourage you, especially for standard English. I know we say this in advanced as well, but get them to write under time conditions
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the times, because you want them really, really feeling that heat, that pressure. How can they produce under that time pressure? And that will be of benefit for them come time for the HSC. One of the things that teachers can provide with feedback is, making sure that their written expression is clear. With the standard cohort, they'll have some good ideas. They'll know how to put it down, but you will have to help them with their own expression, and it's something that I
Okay.
would encourage you to do, especially, like I said, with the standard cohort. Textual evidence. Make sure that every claim that they make is backed up with evidence. And this is where,
Yeah.
again, those comparative tables come in handy, and they add value. Okay, so when you start to look at some of these things, even like checklists, so an essay checklist, make one up, use a checklist maybe that you might have found online, and get kids to sort of look at their response. Does my response, use these elements? They can tick it off as they go.
Nice.
And then, have a look at a few Band 6 exemplars. Maybe past students that have done well. And this will get them to look at, okay, cool, I might be working at this level now, and this is sort of the response that I'm working towards. So by using some of these strategies, you can ensure that your students will move towards that Band 5 and 6 range when it comes to our HSE exam right at the end of the year. And look, one thing I will say is this, just before we do finish, you want your kids to have at least maybe 1, maybe 2 essays prepped and ready to go before the HSC. It's sort of going up against this idea of individuality and individual expression, answering the question on the day. But I guarantee you this, that most kids that are successful, as soon as their time hits, 40 minutes is not a long time. And if they have not prepared anything in advance or even committed something to memory, that's just a strategy that I think is important. And I think a lot of teachers and educators, albeit the practice might be questionable, it's how you get your kids those marks.
But I think you make a great point there with commit something to memory. Some students really do not do well in exam conditions and therefore maybe need to have something concrete like an entire essay. Some students like to commit to memory like a working thesis that they can adapt on the spot. And commit some of the analysis that they can then adapt on the spot. I mean, I know what you're saying, this idea of we do want them to have individual voices, but at the end of the day, there's still the HSC and it is a competition, and the high performers often are just practicing all these different questions and have different approaches, don't they? So we want to make sure our students get a sense of, that competition as well, and hope that gives them a bit of drive to create a few different interpretations and see what fits and works with the question on the day. And I think you've provided some excellent strategies for us. The comparison tables, I think, are a great idea to get students not looking at poems as just as a whole, but looking at the connections between them and the ideas across them and the techniques across them. I think that's the lovely idea how you said, have a look at the same technique, but a different way it's been used and what that function is doing to represent identity and culture. I think that's really highbrow for a standard course, and hopefully would allow a student to produce a unique insight.
Yeah, exactly right. And then, like we sort of just mentioned, we have had the privilege of teaching a few kids that have done well in standard English. I know it's a misconception that Band 6s are very hard to get in standard English, but it's not impossible. Albeit the numbers might say otherwise. But if a kid works hard, on the day, on their given day, any given day, they can get into that sort of range. So it's definitely something that don't be demotivated by it. Work towards that. And hopefully we've got some strategies today that will help us move towards that.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. You've provided us with really great insights, lots of strategies. So any teachers who are doing the contemporary Asian Australian poets have a lot of different angles in which they can go down when they're supporting their students in analysing. And thank you so much. You've produced some really great insights to help the standard English students and teachers doing and teaching standard English.
Awesome.
So
thank you. Thank you. It was a privilege.
Lovely. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please try and engage with us on our socials or on our, Spotify, wherever else you get your podcast. We'd love some insight. We want to build community. We'd love some suggestions on what type of episodes you would like to listen to, what type of content you'd like for us to cover in these episodes. And, if you're enjoying what we're doing and you want to support us along the way and get some more insights, please like, subscribe, share. It really helps us get, the episode out and hopefully get that, community engagement that I think we want, Adriel.
Yeah, 100%. And we're loving it. Thank you for all your support. And we'll continue developing these things as we go. Yeah, we'd love that engagement. Let us know. Let us know what you want to hear.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.